The Senate could also consider several executive nominations, including Janet Yellen to be Fed chair, replacing Ben Bernanke. Yesterday, lawmakers approved the federal budget agreement. That vote was 64 to 36. And now to live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, who has made us children of promise, thank you for bringing joy to our world. We're grateful for the freedom you have given us to enjoy. May we use this gift to live steadfast in liberty, refusing to be entangled in the chains that would shackle us with addictions and miseries. During this season of cheer, give our senators and their loved ones the gifts of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. May they fulfill your command to love their neighbors as they love themselves. Bless also the families and loved ones of our support staffs. O God, let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with us. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., December 19, 2013. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Brian Schatz, a senator from the state of Hawaii, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President Pro Tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to S. 1356.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 243 S. 1356, a bill to amend the Workforce Investment Act of 1998 and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration of the National Defense Authorization Bill. Roll call votes are possible throughout the day, and we'll do our best to notify senators ahead of time as to when the votes will occur. Mr. President, for more than 50 years, consecutively, that is 50 years in a row, every year, the United States has passed the National Defense Authorization Act. This year is not going to be an exception. This tradition indicates the respect and gratitude with which members of this institution regard the members of our military. The work to get to this point has been extremely difficult. We've had the usual good work of one of the finest senators ever, the senior senator from Michigan, and also the cooperation and hard work of the ranking member of the committee, the senior senator from the state of Oklahoma, and it's been with some difficulty. The senator from Oklahoma has had physical problems, the tragic loss of his son in an unfortunate airplane accident. But these two men have continued to move forward with this legislation. And it's important to mention that their counterparts in the House. This is an important piece of legislation that we're going to vote on. Today, the Senate will continue debate on this critical measure with safeguards, which safeguards our nation and ensures our troops have the resources and training they need. This bill includes a pay raise for members of the armed forces and reauthorizes, Mr. President, dozens of special pay rates and bonuses, such as bonus payments for service members who are stationed overseas. This legislation also supports military families who support the mission of our fighting men and women. Also yesterday, we passed the Ryan Murray budget. Very important, because among other things, it did away with sequester, which would have been, if that second year had kicked in, it would have been $23 billion hit to the United States military. That's gone. And this year, the Defense Authorization Act also includes robust new provisions to combat sexual assault in the military and guarantee perpetrators are punished. With cooperation, the Senate could easily pass this bill today. We could have done it last evening. With cooperation, the Senate could also consider a number of pending nominations today and Friday. But without cooperation from our Republican colleagues, senators should expect late night and weekend votes. Mr. President, after we complete work on Defense Authorization Bill, this body will consider several essential nominations, including a new Federal Reserve chair. So important. As we learned yesterday from the announcement of Chairman Ben Bernanke, how terribly important that institution is. He is leaving. We need someone to replace him. We also are going to approve a Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security and a new Director of the Internal Revenue Service. We'll also consider the nominations that have been pending for 2 years. More than 2 years, actually, Mr. President. The nomination of Brian Davis of Florida to fill a judicial seat that has been declared an emergency, as well as a handful of other nominations. All these nominees are qualified and dedicated public servants. I haven't heard a single word about these nominations being flawed in any way. These nominees have broad bipartisan support. Their positions safeguard the economy, thus ensuring our national security. I'm disappointed that Republican senators have suggested that these nominees are non-essential or unimportant. I heard one senator yesterday afternoon say, just do them next year. Another said, yeah, they're non-essential and they're really unimportant. Why don't we do them again? Why don't we do them next year? Mr. President, everyone should understand the Senate will not wait until the new year to consider these nominations. These are critical nominations. And if that means working through the weekend and next week, so be it. The Senate will finish its work before we leave for the holidays. It's our constitutional duty. Public servants who set our nation's monetary policy, guard against terrorism, and deliver its justice don't hold non-essential positions. Mr. President, is Janet Yellen to be chosen as Federal Reserve Chair non-essential? It's shallow to even suggest this. Brian Davis, I've already talked about this good man who has waited 2 years to become a federal trial judge in a place in Florida that has too many criminal cases, too many civil cases. It's been declared a judicial emergency. I suggest that it's very shallow to suggest this nomination is unimportant and not essential. Alejandro Mayorkas, to be the #2 person at the Department of Homeland Security. It's really a vitally important position, as has been laid out in detail by the chairman of the committee, Tom Carper. How shallow to think this important nominee is non-essential. How about this one, Mr. President? John Cuskin, the Director of the Internal Revenue Service, with all the many things going on in this country, with Obamacare, with all the many other things happening, we need someone to direct the Internal Revenue Service. To suggest this is not a critical position is really very, very shallow. With all the Republican obstruction and delay we've seen over the last 2 weeks, is it any wonder Democrats changed the rules last month? Of course not. The American people want Congress to work, not obstruct. Even under these new rules, Republicans are wasting weeks on matters that could be resolved in mere hours. As always, there's an easy and a hard way that we legislators can take. One is to move, the other is to obstruct. So far, my Republican colleagues have obstructed and continue to do so. The choice to obstruct is theirs. Their obstruction has become a bad habit of theirs. For the good of the country, their obstruction, these bad habits need to go away. Mr. President, I would like the chair to announce the business of the day.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the House message to accompany H.R. 3304, which the clerk will report.
House message to accompany H.R. 3304.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Well, as you heard just moments ago, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid say the focus in the Senate today will be 2014 defense programs and policy. It's about $625 billion for Pentagon spending. We are expecting votes at some point today, although it's unclear when those votes would happen. We are hearing, though, that a vote on final passage of the defense policy and programs bill could happen at about 10:30 or 11 o'clock this evening. Also among the agenda items in the Senate today, the Senate is considering a number of executive nominations. John Koskinen to be the head of the IRS and Janet Yellen to be the next Fed chair. Current chair Ben Bernanke stepping down beginning next month. One of the larger agenda items for the week is the federal budget. That two-year measure was agreed to here in the Senate with bipartisan support yesterday. The vote on that was 64 to 36. Majority Leader Reid this morning also suggesting the Democrat-controlled Senate could have late nights, weekend sessions, and even work next week to handle Senate business before they leave for the Christmas break unless they get Republicans' cooperation.
Majority Leader. Without objection.
Unanimous consent, the Senate proceed to S. 1859. A bill includes the following provisions: an extension of a provision to exclude mortgage debt forgiveness from taxable income, deductions for state and local sales taxes, qualified tuition expenses for students, and classroom expenses that teachers pay out of their own pockets, a commuter benefit that helps workers who take mass transit to their jobs every day, the new markets tax credit, and the low-income housing credit, tax benefits to encourage investment in our nation's infrastructure, such as the short line rail tax credit, provisions that encourage the development of renewable energy technology, including the production tax credit for wind, as well as credits to promote the development of biofuels, alternative fuel vehicles, and energy-efficient buildings, and tax incentives for small and large businesses, including Section 179 expensing, bonus depreciation, and R&D credit. I further ask the bill be read a third time passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. It's unfortunate that the Senate schedule is completely full with pending cloture motions on both controversial or completely non-urgent nominations. If these nominations were deferred, we could consider this important and timely legislation today. I therefore ask consent that the pending cloture motions on executive nominations be withdrawn and that following disposition of the defense bill, the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of H.R. 2668, a House-passed revenue measure, and that the text of S. 1859 be the first amendment in order, and that the majority and minority sides then be recognized to offer amendments in an alternating fashion so that these important issues could be considered this week.
Mr. President, reserving my right to object, and I would just ask my statement that I gave earlier today appear in the record, and I object.
Without objection. The objection is heard to the modification. Is there objection to the original request?
Object.
The objection is heard. Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I'd like to briefly comment on the absurdity of what just transpired here on the Senate floor. My friends on the other side have been the longest-serving majority since 1980. We're enduring, some would say suffering, the 7th consecutive year of their majority. Yet if someone were to take a close look at the strategy and tactics of the Senate Democratic leadership, they'd think that the roles were reversed. Democrats are the majority. They have even enhanced their majority by breaking the rules of the Senate to give themselves more power. Indeed, they've not been a bit reluctant to overreach. Part and parcel of having a majority here in the Senate is control over the Senate schedule and committees. Yet still we see what we saw here today from my friends on the other side of the aisle. Under the Senate rules, tax policy matters, including the tax extenders. They are referred to the Finance Committee. Trade adjustment assistance, which was also included in this bill, also falls under the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee processed tax extenders in a bipartisan fashion last year, and that legislation was eventually enacted into law. The committee has also been able, though without as much bipartisan support, deal with the TAA in the recent past. Yet now, what do my friends want to do? They want to ignore the Senate rules, the expertise and proper role of the Finance Committee, and pass a complicated set of policies here on the floor without discussion or debate. Now, with regard to tax extenders, Finance Committee staff from both parties have in just the past few days started the process of developing tax extenders legislation. To put it bluntly, the majority leader's partisan actions today make a sham of that deliberative, methodical, and constructive bipartisan effort. Why are they afraid of going through regular order? They are the majority, including my friend the chairman. There are 13 Democrats on the Finance Committee and only 11 Republicans. What are they afraid of? Don't they set the committee agenda? Don't they have the votes? Political stunts like unanimous consent requests that are designed only to draw objections from the other side may be good political fun for the proponents. They might even provide some good campaign fodder, but they don't solve any problems. It's amazing to see this kind of activity from a Senate majority party when it controls the agenda, both on the floor and in the committees. You might expect these kinds of actions from a frustrated minority party which feels shut out of the role in committees and on the floor. But here you have a role reversal. I'm here currently a member of the minority party in the Senate defending regular order, Senate customs, and the role of the committee system. I'll reiterate my challenge to my friends in the Senate Democratic leadership. Why are you so afraid of regular order? Why not process this legislation in a careful, methodical, and transparent manner? Being in the majority means being accountable. Today, my friends on the other side of the aisle tried, once again, to avoid accountability in order to blame their own failings on Republicans. And as the saying goes, that dog just won't hunt. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
If I may, before the senator from Utah leaves the floor, I think correctly stated the state of the Senate these days. I mean, it's not the same body it was just a few years ago in the way that we are being treated. It's a very discouraging development as we approach the end of the year to see the way the United States Senate has deteriorated under the current leadership. And I thank the senior senator from Utah for pointing out that it was not just too long ago that the two parties actually functioned on issues like the majority leader was trying to ram through today without any committee consideration.
The distinguished minority leader expresses it very well. I'm appalled. I've only been here 37 years, but I've never seen the rules as violated as they have been lately. And frankly, violated in a way that really is destructive of the Senate, not helpful or constructive to the Senate. And this was just another illustration, and I think our side is getting pretty sick of it.
I thank my friend from Utah. Mr. President, earlier this year, the Internal Revenue Service admitted responsibility for an incredible abuse of power. In the midst of an election season, it targeted and harassed Americans for the supposed crime of thinking differently. An agency with access to some of the most personal information of every taxpayer, every tax-paying American, betrayed their trust. And in doing so, it showed the lengths to which this administration will go to stifle those who dissent from its policies. All of this was and remains a complete outrage. It's the kind of thing we might expect from a banana republic or a third world dictatorship, not the world's leading democracy. And the worst part is we still don't know everything that happened or if it's still going on. That's because the bipartisan investigation into all of this still hasn't concluded. It's unclear to me how seriously the White House is taking this investigation. In many ways, it seems to have treated the scandal more as a public relations problem to get past than a serious problem to solve. And now, get this. They just expect the elected representatives of the people to roll over and rubber stamp a new presidential nominee to head the IRS. They want Congress to forget what happened, too, and just simply move on. They expect us to just clear the way tomorrow and let them ram through the president's new pick to run the IRS. Look, the American people deserve answers about how and why this targeting happened. And they deserve justice, too. And I'll not be supporting any nominee to lead this agency until the American people get the answers they deserve. But of course the Democrats in charge of the Senate changed the rules a few weeks back in order to ensure they could get their way on nominees, no matter what the American people think. It's the same kind of attitude we've seen on the defense bill, where the majority leader prevented other members from offering amendments. They'll just do what they want, even if it means breaking the rules. So, if John Koskinen does find himself confirmed tomorrow, I want him to know a few things. First of all, he should understand that I don't hold any animus toward him personally. Under different circumstances, I might well have been able to support him. We had a good conversation when we met recently to discuss his nomination. But he's also someone I'll be keeping a close watch on, as will the other members of my conference, as will the American people, because big challenges lie ahead for the next IRS commissioner, no matter who he or she may be. We expect the next IRS commissioner to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation into this scandal. We expect whoever is eventually confirmed to hold those who broke or bent the rules fully accountable. We expect the next commissioner to fairly implement the laws that he or she is charged with executing. Now, to his credit, the nominee has assured me he agrees with me on a topic I feel very, very strongly about, that the IRS should stay out of regulating political speech. Let me say that again. The IRS should stay out of regulating political speech. He told me so himself, that he agreed with that, and I was pleased to hear it. And so, were he to become commissioner, I'd expect him to oppose the extremely misguided proposed IRS rule that aims to overturn more than 50 years of settled law and practice, unfairly targeting the speech of those who criticize the administration while leaving its supporters untouched. This proposed rule, which redefines what, quote, social welfare, end quote, means in order to target certain groups that seek to educate the public, would end up penalizing federal, state, and local organizations for the supposed crime of providing information, much of it nonpartisan or bipartisan. The goal is clear: to make it easier to push through the back door what congressional Democrats have been unable to pass through the front door, discriminatory policies that seek to silence those who dare to oppose them. It's just the latest in a long and troubling pattern of Chicago-style tactics under this administration. And it's exactly the kind of political meddling that the next commissioner needs to ensure never happens again. So let's not forget, the IRS should be a boring place, an impartial agency of tax collectors, not the vanguard of the left. The next commissioner needs to see to it that the organization finally returns to its mission, and he or she needs to root out those who would have the IRS target Americans for the way they think. Lastly, as I've told the nominee, I'm deeply concerned about the IRS role in implementing Obamacare. The fact of the matter is, Obamacare represents a dramatic expansion of the use of the tax code to pick winners and losers. It gives the agency broad new responsibilities for enforcing Obamacare's most onerous mandates and to hand out nearly $1 trillion in taxpayer subsidies. And in order to do all of this, it will need to know who has insurance, penalize those who don't, and determine who's eligible for subsidies and how much they ought to receive, something that the agency has a very troubled history in doing with other programs. And if they get any of that wrong, they'll need to come back and repossess subsidies after the fact. In my view, the IRS doesn't have any business snooping even further into the lives of our constituents, especially at a time when it is already under a cloud of scandal. It's just one of the many reasons I opposed Obamacare in the first place and why I continue to oppose it. So if the nominee is to become commissioner, then at a minimum, I expect him to hold the agency to the highest standards when it comes to protecting the privacy of the people we all represent. I expect him to provide regular, transparent updates to Congress on the status of implementation and to let us know of any problems as soon as they arise. The last thing we need, Mr. President, is for the IRS to compound the pain it and Obamacare have already inflicted upon the American people by allowing fraud and further mistreatment to happen under its watch. The IRS has done a lot to lose the trust of the American people. It will need to do a lot more to regain it. Following the advice I just laid out would put the IRS on a better path. And if this nominee ends up becoming the next commissioner, that advice will form the criteria upon which his performance will be judged. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, first I want to ask unanimous consent that Krishna Patel, a detailee of Senator Johnson's Banking Committee staff, be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's session.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to call attention to a critical provision in the Tax Extenders Act which I wish would have received the consent because it's important for creating prosperity and economic opportunity in our country and to give certainty to businesses in order to achieve that goal. And that Extenders Act provides our nation's most innovative businesses some certainty as they plan their investments for next year. Every year, the Congress extends a very popular law that provides a tax credit to businesses for certain research expenses. This credit is important for a number of reasons. It creates jobs, it encourages more research, and it bolsters U.S. competitiveness. Unfortunately, despite the efforts of a number of us here in the Congress, notably the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee, the credit is temporary and has been extended on what's been an annual basis. It's unfortunate because the lack of long-term certainty prevents businesses from fully relying on the credit when making their global investment decisions. And I know that the presiding chair understands this very well as a state in New Jersey that has some of the leading innovative companies in the world that very often rely on the research and development tax credit to make those millions, sometimes billions of dollars of an investment in order to produce the next life-saving, life-enhancing drugs or the next technology breakthrough. In the meantime, at the very least, we can ensure that that credit is extended. If we can't make it permanent, it should be extended in a timely fashion to give businesses confidence in putting more research investment in the United States in 2014. This bill would extend the research and development tax credit for another year, and I sincerely hope we'll be able to get this done very soon in order to maximize the credit's effectiveness, in order to unlock that investment, in order to create the economic opportunity, the jobs, and the growth in our economy. And I'd like to yield to my colleague, the senior senator from Ohio, to discuss another important provision in this bill.
I thank
the senator from Ohio.
I thank this presiding officer of the senator from New Jersey and ask unanimous consent to be succeeded in my comments on the extenders of Senator Cantwell. I ask unanimous consent that.
Without objection.
I thank the presiding officer. I'm here to join my colleagues in asking for unanimous consent to pass, which we will do later, to pass the Tax Extenders Act of 2013. The bill will do a number of important things, including, particularly importantly for my state, extending the health care tax credit, or the HCTC. It's important that we extend it for workers and retirees who lose their jobs and benefits due to no fault of their own. Extending HCTC preserves a program that people in my home state of Ohio, like Delphi's salaried retirees who worked hard and play by the rules, know, understand, and trust. These tax credits are set to expire in just 2 weeks at the end of the year. While affordable health insurance will be available on the health exchanges, one of the most important things about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, extending the HCTC ensures that retirees who have already faced a number of transitions can keep insurance that is familiar to them while they learn about new options. Extending the tax credit for 1 year is fiscally responsible. We could and should do more. We should improve the HCTC and make it permanent, as I proposed in legislation that I've introduced with Senators Rockefeller and Stabenow and Arona and Donnelly. But in the meantime, we could and should, at the very least, maintain this critical tax credit for a population who needs it desperately. That's what this bill does. That's why the Senate should move it soon by unanimous consent. I'd like to take a moment to emphasize how important the Tax Extenders Act of 2013 is on a number of other issues besides the HCTC and credits that my friends have discussed. Among other important measures, we should move to extend the New Markets Tax Credit and the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. These programs are oversubscribed and are able to help revitalize communities by leveraging tens of billions of dollars in private investments. They're among the best programs programs we have for economic development in Ohio and across the country. I strongly support that extension. Finally, I want to associate myself with Senator Stabenow in calling for unanimous consent to pass the Tax Extenders Act of 2013 in order to extend mortgage debt relief. Without this critical extension, homeowners who make modifications to their mortgage or receive loan forgiveness could face a crippling tax bill. Imagine that. After you've done a loan modification, whatever money you saved, you're taxed on. Imagine getting that tax bill. That's why the mortgage debt relief extender is so very important. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank Leader Reid and Chairman Baucus and Senator Schumer, Senator Stabenow, Senator Wyden, Senator Brown, and Senator Menendez, all for coming to the floor to talk about this important issue of tax extenders and why we need to get them done now. In Washington, the state of Washington, taxpayers are opening the morning's newspaper to find the Seattle Times editorial, "Congress should extend the sales tax deduction." The Seattle Times has been following this issue for years and knows that taxpayers are waiting to find out if that we can continue to deduct our sales tax from our federal income tax obligation. Being a state that doesn't have an income tax, we want parity with other states, and we want to be able to deduct our sales tax, a form of those taxes, from our federal tax obligations. And every year, millions of Washingtonians have to wait to find out whether that particular tax provision is going to be extended. I want to make it permanent, and I hope that when we do tax reform, we will be able to do this. But in the meantime, we got to give the certainty to taxpayers in Washington State that these important tax policies, that Congress can act and get things done. So I'd like to submit for the record that particular editorial. At New Year's, as the ball drops in Times Square, a number of other tax provisions are going to expire. And the lapse of these important tax provisions make it harder for Americans to invest in clean energy, to hire veterans, to pay for public transportation, and to build low-income housing. Like my colleague Senator Brown was discussing, the tax extenders of 2013 is about providing predictability and certainty to the citizens and to American businesses about what are tax benefits and investments. On January 1st, the commuter tax benefit will expire. That means that an increase in household expense for 2.7 million public transit commuters. In King County, which is the county that Seattle is in, more than 1,600 workers use the commuter tax benefit to enable employees to get to and from work. And if you've ever been in the Puget Sound area, you know that transportation and traffic are big issues for us. So obviously trying to defer some of that traffic congestion by getting people into commuter transportation is a key part of our strategy. But if we're taking away the certainty and predictability of tax deductions on this, we're just going to make our transportation problems worse. On New Year's Day, the tax benefit for those employees who take public transit will be cut nearly in half, from $245 to $130 per month, and we need to extend this benefit as a matter of tax fairness. Transportation is the second largest expense in an American household, and American families should be able to choose whether they want to drive or take public transit, and they shouldn't be punished because they're taking a bus or ferry or train. And across Washington State, we've seen firsthand how the other tax extenders help actually create an environment of certainty and predictability for jobs and job creation. These are bipartisan principles that we can all get behind. Of particular importance to me is, as I said, the state and local sales tax deduction, which affects many people in our state. Individuals living in other states with a state income tax are not faced with these same challenges, but Alaska, Florida, Nevada, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, and Wyoming are all in the same boat. And I'm sure these citizens would want to have the sales tax deduction certainty and predictability. As a result of that, a tax average of $640 a deduction is real money back into people's pockets when they itemize those various tax benefits, and so we hope that this won't continue to be placed in Washington State. We need these tax extenders now. Additionally, there are other things like the new market tax credit, which is a great program for encouraging investment into challenging areas of our country, the biodiesel tax credit, the Veterans Work Opportunity Tax Credit, a tax credit to employers to encourage them to hire veterans, and we have had many of these events around Washington State talking to employers who've successfully used this tax credit. The low-income housing tax credit, I know the President of the Senate probably has projects all over his state that have benefited from the low-income housing tax credit, a great incentive to get more affordable housing built in hard-to-serve areas and challenging areas because of high costs. As I mentioned, the commuter tax benefit, all of these are tied to job creation. So instead of giving predictability and certainty on tax credits, here we are not getting our job done, and we should get this done as soon as possible. It's time for Congress to extend these important provisions and to make plans accordingly. I hope that the IRS could be given the predictability and certainty, too, in the new year about these provisions so that we're not delaying or affecting the tax season at the end of next year. So the time to act is now, and I hope my colleagues will help us get these measures that usually are renewed in a bipartisan fashion, done so as soon as possible. So I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I want to thank my friend and colleague from Washington for her passion and advocacy, and I want to join with her and other colleagues today in supporting the unanimous consent request to pass immediately the Tax Extenders Act. There's no reason not to get this done, as colleagues have said. Absolutely none. We're in a situation where there are critical tax policies that will directly affect families. Middle-class families across the country are going to be hit by a number of different things, small businesses, large businesses, a number of different entities will be affected if we don't get this passed. And I want to specifically talk about an urgent priority that I have been authoring, and we've been able to shepherd through a number of different times that needs to get done as a part of this package or by itself, however we want to do it. We need to make sure that struggling homeowners across the country and in terms of all of the economy as well are able to continue using tax policy to protect them from not only being hit with a mortgage problem that puts them underwater and struggling to keep their homes, but an extra tax bill on top of it that makes absolutely no sense. And let me explain that. At the end of the year, a law that I authored back in 2007 to protect homeowners against unforeseen and unfair tax bills is set to expire. Before this law, when a portion of a distressed homeowner's mortgage was canceled, either in a loan workout with a bank, a short sale, or even a foreclosure in some instances, the IRS treated the canceled debt as taxable income. So think about that for a minute. You're already struggling with your home. You could lose your home, or maybe you're able to refinance in some way and work with the bank, get a short sale, and then on top of that, you get a tax bill for whatever the value was of what you were able to work out. It makes absolutely no sense. It's frankly outrageous. The IRS was telling homeowners that money they had already lost on their home was income. So we have essentially been correcting that since 2007 through a tax change. The IRS before that was taxing families on what is considered phantom income at the worst possible time for the family. With the onset of the housing crisis, Congress recognized how critical it was to protect struggling homeowners from paying this kind of tax on mortgage debt relief. In 2007, we provided tax relief for homeowners by excluding mortgage forgiveness from their income for tax purposes. Made sense then, it makes sense now. Expires at the end of the year. We came together on a bipartisan basis. We said to millions of families, working families, middle-class families struggling to keep a roof over their head for their families, that if you're struggling with an underwater mortgage, the IRS shouldn't kick you while you're down. You can seek relief without having to worry about incurring a massive tax bill. This provision has aided millions of families and helped enable the housing market to begin to recover. However, in too many areas of the country, and for far too many homeowners, the housing crisis is far from over. Nearly 6.5 million homeowners are still underwater in their mortgages. They owe more than their homes are worth. And that includes 250,000 hardworking families in Michigan. Nearly 13% nationally of homeowners are underwater. And again, 18% are in Michigan, above the national average. It's critical that we extend this provision, and it is very important that it be done before the end of the year. It needs to be done ahead of time so that homeowners know what the IRS rules are going to be in 2014, as they are literally making decisions today, tomorrow, the next day, over Christmas. They need to know. If we don't act, homeowners who are offered relief from their lenders or are thinking about a short sale won't know if they'll be hit with a major tax bill as a result, and that will affect decisions that are being made. On average, underwater homeowners owe $53,000 more on their mortgage than the market value of their homes. In some cases, of course, much more. For a typical middle-class family, that could mean a tax bill of more than $13,000, Mr. President. Merry Christmas, $13,000 tax bill you shouldn't be paying as you're trying to figure out how to protect your home. Who would want to take that risk? Brokers and housing counselors in Michigan have been asking me what they should tell homeowners, and we need to act right now so that we can tell them they don't have to worry about this. This is not just about fairness for homeowners. This is about keeping the housing recovery alive. The last thing we want to do is to tax people into foreclosure, where they feel their only option is default and walking away from their home. As we've seen in so many communities, foreclosures and vacant properties destabilize neighborhoods, and I can walk from community to community in Michigan and show where that has happened. They push home values down. We can't let that happen at a time when the housing market and the economy are finally recovering. So we all have a stake in extending this important tax protection for families. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a letter from the National Association of Realtors.
Without objection.
Thank you. And one from over 200 housing, consumer, and community organizations urging us to act now.
Also without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, this is a bipartisan initiative that I've introduced with Senator Heller and 18 other bipartisan co-sponsors. To my knowledge, it is not controversial. There is no excuse not to act before we leave, and I would urge colleagues to do so. Thank you.
The senator from New York.
Mr. President, thank you. First, I want to thank my colleague from Michigan for her heartfelt words. I couldn't agree with her more on the mortgage deduction. And I want to thank the Majority Leader and my colleagues from Ohio and New Jersey as well for recognizing the importance of this package of tax relief. The Tax Extenders Act of 2013 would extend tax relief that business and middle-class families in my home state of New York and across the country depend on. They are non-controversial. They have gotten bipartisan support in the past, and because of the great uncertainty over our economy, doing this quickly and not saying we'll do it 3 months after it passes, after they expire, makes a great deal of sense. So I would hope my colleagues, I know they've objected to all of these, on the other side of the aisle would reconsider, because for the good of the economy, which is just beginning to pick up a little bit, we need to do these extenders. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 of them, but one is particularly critical, and that is because it doesn't work very well retroactively. The others do. And that's why I would urge my colleagues to reconsider, and I am going to ask for a separate UC before we leave here on this particular one, because it has particular need right now, and that is the mass transit, the commuter tax benefit. There are about 700,000 commuters in the New York metropolitan area, including from your home state, Mr. President, that take advantage of this current incentive. The commuter benefit currently covers up to $245 a month from a person's income to pay for their mass transit commute to and from work. So whether you take the subway, the bus, the train, or drive to work and park, the benefit provides significant savings. The tradition, unfortunately, in this Senate and in this Congress was to treat mass transit as a second-class citizen, if you will, because the benefit traditionally had been significantly greater for those who drive and park than for those who take mass transit. And we have had serious problems. First, the mass transit one, until we changed it a few years back, was half the benefit of the transit, of the parking and driving. And second, it was not indexed for inflation the way the parking benefit was. And so, if we let this provision expire, the mass transit benefit will revert to $130 a month, while those who drive and park will actually get an increase to $250 for 2014 because of inflation. We cannot let these transit benefits for mass transit users get left behind. To do them is a win-win-win. It's a win, of course, for those who use mass transit, and we have so many in the New York area. It's also a win for drivers, because every person who is encouraged to use mass transit by this benefit will actually take a car off the road, remove some degree of congestion, and allow drivers to move more quickly. And of course it's a win for our environment, because mass transit is a far more effective way environmentally of moving things along. So when the leader a few minutes ago requested that the Senate pass the Tax Extenders Act, I was disappointed that it was blocked, and particularly disappointed that this benefit was blocked, because, as I said, while we can do it retroactively, it's harder to implement than the others that are done retroactively, because most of them take effect when you pay your taxes in 2015, whereas this one takes effect month by month by month. The proposal that we're asking for is exactly the same as was included in the bipartisan negotiated tax extenders package, considered by the Senate Finance Committee and passed by the Senate on a bipartisan basis for one additional year through 2014. I hope we'll consider it now, not retroactively later next year as we did last year. Employers need to plan whether they'll provide the benefit. Commuters need to elect to take it. And as I said, it's done on a monthly basis. You can do it retroactively, but it's much harder. So I would hope, I know we have lots of problems here between the parties, but we should not hold the mass transit commuters of America hostage. We should not make them second-class citizens. Their deduction is every bit as important, every bit as justifiable as those who drive and park. And I would hope my colleagues, before we adjourn this year for the Christmas holiday, would, in the Christmas spirit, extend this benefit. Now, I'd like to talk about a few other credits that are also part of the package, that are also being blocked right now. One is the new market tax credit. Individuals and businesses across my state are counting on the new market tax credit. The new market credit program was created to stimulate private sector investment in economically distressed communities. It's done exactly that. I've seen it work in Buffalo, in Rochester, in Syracuse, in the Capital District, in New York. Over the first decade of the program, $20 billion in new market tax credit investment leveraged an additional $25 billion in capital from other sources to finance economic development in communities where financing might be difficult to come by. The program is a proven job creator. Between 2003 and 2010, new market tax credit investments created over 500,000 jobs across the country. Again, it's always had bipartisan support. It's sort of a no-brainer. It should be continued. Let me now talk about the short line rail tax credit. It's a little like the new market tax credit in that it's a tax credit that encourages private investment and jobs. We have short lines all across the country. They connect the main trunk lines on rail to the more isolated regions. But in those somewhat isolated regions are factories. We have opportunities for tourism, say in the Adirondacks, and the short line rail tax credit helps maintain and renovate the short line rail system. Rail is very prosperous these days. The big carriers can maintain the trunk lines very well, but it's harder to maintain the short line. and Congress, in its wisdom, decided to give a tax break for those. If you're unfamiliar, the short line rails are a web of tracks all over the country, connecting local businesses and manufacturers to interstate rail systems. The unheralded links that bring raw materials into our businesses and connect them with other cities and supply chains. They must be maintained. Over 50% of rail track in my home state are short-line rails. Approximately 550 short-line railroads preserve 50,000 miles of track in the country, and the credit is extremely useful in my state, financing hundreds of thousands of dollars in rail infrastructure investment annually. And it's used all across the country. We have 42 bipartisan co-sponsors in the Senate for this legislation. So I hope we will consider this one and pass it. Finally, the IRA rollover. The IRA rollover provision is also set to expire, affecting so many retirees. They need to know whether or not it will be extended in order to plan their charitable giving in the coming year. If it isn't extended, many taxpayers over 70 and a half years of age will be surprised with a tax bill when they transfer funds from their IRA to their favorite charity in 2014. So this is important, and again, it's one that truly is in the Christmas spirit. So in conclusion, Mr. President, businesses, families, retirees will pay the price if all of these valuable tax relief provisions and many of the others mentioned by Senator Reid are not extended by the end of the year. I would hope, in the same spirit of comity that we passed the budget, we could come together and pass these extenders. They have always had bipartisan support. They are, after all, tax reductions. I know my colleagues on the other side of the aisle believe in tax reductions. And to delay them and do them retroactively would be doing a disservice to our economy and to the millions of Americans who are working or seeking work in our country today. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, before he leaves the floor, I just want to commend my colleague from New York for a very fine statement. He and I sit next to each other on the Finance Committee, and we are going to be working very closely together on these issues. Mr. President, I have long felt that the best choice in terms of looking at these tax issues is comprehensive tax reform. The reality is the tax code in America is a dysfunctional mess. It is 100 years old at this point, and I think it's pretty fair to say it looks its age every year. And when it comes to energy, and clearly a lot of senators on both sides of the aisle have done a lot of work on this, my preference would be that the Congress would simplify the various energy provisions, replace the dozens of separate incentives for each energy technology with fewer technology-neutral, performance-based incentives that bring us to a more level playing field in the energy area, a more level playing field, and one where there would be certainty for those who are going to do the innovation, those in New Jersey and Oregon and elsewhere who have those kind of breakthrough innovative ideas and who are telling us that they badly need to get off this roller coaster of extenders and have some real predictability for the important innovative work that needs to be done. Those kinds of incentives should take into account important policy goals of domestic energy security and reducing this country's carbon footprint while getting the tax code more out of the way and letting the free market decide which technologies break through and ultimately succeed. It is my view that what Chairman Baucus released yesterday, and he consulted with us extensively, certainly has some promising ideas in that regard. Now, with respect to where this debate is now, I think it's important to be clear about the challenge. It looks more and more like the other body has, in effect, decided to, if not slow walk tax reform, certainly take its time. Last month, the news here in Washington was full of headlines about various discussions among the House leaders, and you got the sense, I'll let them speak for themselves, that on the tax reform issue, they were apparently going to take their foot off the gas. So, Mr. President, it does not seem that the other body is poised to move forward anytime soon on comprehensive tax reform. So because there is little indication that the other body is going to move on this, my view is letting the incentives for the renewable energy resources in particular, solar and wind and other renewables and energy efficiency, in effect get thrown overboard, in effect sacrificed on this altar of inaction, that would be a huge mistake. If you do that, you're talking about putting at risk thousands and thousands of American jobs and jobs that are critical to our country's energy, environmental, and economic security. And my view is having these employers and having these innovative, cutting-edge technologies fall off the cliff would be a mistake. And that's why it's critical that Congress address and extend these key energy tax benefits as soon as possible. Until the Congress takes the prudent step of broad-based reform of our tax system, the American people should not be left hanging. We ought to minimize the roller coaster of uncertainty that has been a drag on growth in recent years. So, Mr. President, passing the Tax Extenders Act of 2013 and extending these important expiring provisions delivers a measure of confidence and continuity. And it builds a bridge between the current tax system and where all members of Congress ought to hope that we end up. And that's with a modern, pro-growth tax code worthy of the American economy and ready for the 21st century. I have been interested in that subject, Mr. President, for a number of years. I can just briefly recount some of the history. Rahm Emanuel, now mayor of Chicago, and I introduced the first comprehensive reform effort. When he was still in the other body, we weren't even able to get a Republican to join us in that effort. Then Senator Judd Gregg, our colleague, our former colleague from New Hampshire, sat across from me on a sofa every week for 2 years, and we were able to come together with a tax reform proposal, much of which I continue to believe is valid today. Then our current colleague, Senator Dan Coates, was willing to work with myself and Senator Begich and others, and he made important contributions. So we very much need to have a modern, pro-growth, pro-entrepreneur tax code that really is up to the challenges of the 21st century. That is my first choice, Mr. President. That is not what is in front of us today. Clearly, when the House made the decision to pull back for various reasons, we were faced with the question of whether we were just going to sit by and, as a result of inaction, see these important renewable energy industries and the jobs they represent sacrificed. And I hope the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, will say that's not acceptable. Pass the Tax Extenders Act of 2013 on a bipartisan basis. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. Yeah, absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.